Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully unpleasant. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe lie down somewhere comfortable, and prepare yourself for a slow, drifting journey into a world that smelled absolutely terrible. And I mean that in the most historically accurate way possible. Because tonight we are talking about why it really, truly sucked to be a medieval butcher. Which sounds like a solid, respectable job on paper. Right, steady work, always in demand. People need food, animals exist. You do the math. But as we gently wander through the narrow, muddy streets of a medieval town, you'll start to realize that being a butcher was less honest trade and more daily endurance test against filth, smell, and existential regret. And honestly, it's kind of impressive anyone signed up for it at all. So imagine waking up before sunrise, not to birds chirping or a calm breeze, but to the faint, lingering smell of blood that never quite leaves your clothes, your hands, or your soul. Because once you become a butcher, that smell is basically your lifelong companion, like an unwanted pet that just refuses to leave. And as you roll out of bed, you already know what your day is going to look like. Because unlike modern jobs where every day might bring something new, a medieval butcher's life was beautifully consistent in the worst possible way. Animals come in alive. And by the end of the day, they very much are not. And in between those 2 points is a long, messy process that nobody really wanted to think about too deeply. Except, unfortunately, the butcher had to think about it constantly, because it was literally his entire job. Now, before we get into the blood and the smell and the general chaos, let's just appreciate the setting for a moment. Medieval towns were not exactly known for their cleanliness. In fact, cleanliness was more of a vague suggestion than an actual goal. Streets were often muddy, sometimes mixed with waste, sometimes mixed with things you really didn't want to identify, and drainage systems were, let's just say, creative. So right away, the butcher is operating in an environment that is already working against him. And then you add animal slaughter on top of that, and suddenly you've created what can only be described as a sensory nightmare. And yet, this was completely normal. People just accepted it. Because meat doesn't magically appear. Someone has to do the unpleasant part. And congratulations, that someone is our poor butcher. And of course, butchers weren't just randomly scattered around town. They were usually grouped together in specific areas, often near water sources because you need a lot of water when your job involves, well, blood and washing things, and trying to pretend you're maintaining some level of hygiene, which to be fair, they were. Just not by modern standards. So these butcher districts became their own little ecosystems, filled with the constant sound of animals, tools, shouting, and the occasional argument over whose goat wandered where. Because apparently even in medieval times, workplace drama was alive and thriving, just with more livestock involved. Now let's talk about the animals themselves, because this is where things start to get a little more immersive. And by immersive, I mean mildly horrifying if you think about it too much. Animals were not shipped in neatly packaged, pre-prepared forms like today. They arrived alive, confused, probably stressed, and definitely not aware of what was about to happen. And it was the butcher's job to handle everything from that point forward, which meant dealing with noise, movement, unpredictability, and sometimes outright resistance, because animals, surprisingly, do not enjoy being turned into dinner. And so the butcher needed a mix of physical strength, skill, and a certain level of emotional detachment, because if you got too sentimental about it, you were not going to last very long in this profession. And if you didn't get sentimental at all, well, congratulations, you were probably exactly the kind of person this job required. And here's the thing, this wasn't a quick or easy process. It required precision. Because people expected quality meat. Even back then, nobody wanted something poorly handled. So the butcher had to know what he was doing, where to cut, how to process the animal efficiently, how to separate different parts, and how to do all of this while standing in conditions that were, let's just say, less than ideal. Because again, we're talking about a time before modern sanitation, before refrigeration, before basically anything that would make this job easier. So everything had to be done quickly, carefully, and with a constant awareness that if you messed up, The consequences weren't just professional embarrassment. They could actually affect people's health, which adds a nice little layer of pressure to an already stressful job, because why not? And speaking of pressure, let's not forget the social side of things, because medieval society had a very interesting way of ranking professions, and butchers, despite being essential, didn't exactly enjoy the highest status. In fact, they were often viewed with a certain level of suspicion or even mild disgust, because people appreciated meat, but they didn't necessarily appreciate the person who made it possible, which is a bit ironic when you think about it. Like everyone wants the end product, but nobody wants to acknowledge the messy reality behind it. So butchers found themselves in this strange position where they were needed, but not particularly admired, which must have been just wonderful for their self-esteem. Waking up every day to do a job that people rely on, but also kind of look down on, like, "Thank you for your service. Please stand over there and maybe wash your hands. Actually, never mind, just stay over there." And then there's the smell, which honestly deserves its own moment, because it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a defining feature of the job: blood, animal waste, raw meat, all mixed together in an environment that didn't exactly prioritize ventilation. And once that smell gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin, it's not going anywhere, so the butcher carried it with him everywhere, which made social interactions interesting, to say the least. Imagine trying to have a normal conversation while people are subtly leaning away from you, not because they dislike you personally, but because you smell like your workplace, and your workplace smells like, well, death. And that's just not a great combination for making friends or impressing anyone, especially in a time when personal hygiene was already a bit of a challenge for everyone. So being the guy who smelled worse than average was really saying something. And of course, let's not pretend that butchers worked alone in peaceful silence. Their workspaces were often busy, noisy, and occasionally chaotic, with multiple people involved. Animals moving around, tools clanging, water splashing, and voices rising as instructions were shouted over the general commotion. And in the middle of all this, the butcher had to stay focused, because one wrong move could lead to injury. And injuries were not something you wanted to deal with in a medieval setting, where medical care was, let's call it, limited. So safety was important, but also not always guaranteed, which adds yet another layer of stress to the job. Because it's not just unpleasant, it's also potentially dangerous, which really makes you wonder what the recruitment pitch for this profession looked like. Come join us, you'll work long hours, smell terrible, face social stigma, and occasionally risk injury, but hey, at least you'll always have work, which, to be fair, was probably a strong selling point in a time when job security was not exactly a given. And then, after all the cutting and processing and general effort, there's the matter of selling the meat, because the butcher wasn't just a processor, he was also a merchant, which meant interacting with customers, handling transactions, and maintaining some level of reputation. Because if people didn't trust your meat, they wouldn't buy it, and that's bad for business. So there was this constant balancing act between doing the messy work behind the scenes and presenting a somewhat respectable front to the public, which is not easy when your entire operation is built around something that most people would rather not think about too deeply. So the butcher had to develop a certain kind of personality, practical, resilient, maybe a little blunt, because when your daily life involves this much reality, you probably don't have much patience for nonsense. And honestly, that's kind of understandable. Now, as we slowly drift deeper into this world, it becomes clear that being a medieval butcher wasn't just a job. It was a lifestyle, one that shaped your daily routine, your social standing, your physical condition, and even your identity. Because once you were in it, you were in it. There wasn't exactly a quick career switch option waiting around the corner. So you adapted, you got used to the smell, the work, the expectations, and you carried on, because that's what people did. They worked with what they had, even if what they had was not ideal, and in this case, very much not ideal, but also necessary, because without butchers, the entire system of food supply would start to fall apart, and nobody wanted that. So despite everything, the butcher remained an essential part of medieval life. quietly enduring a job that most people were very happy not to have. And as we gently move forward, letting this image settle in your mind, the dim light, the narrow streets, the steady rhythm of work that never quite stops, we'll start to explore even more of the strange, uncomfortable realities that came with this profession. Because believe it or not, we've only just scratched the surface, and things could always get a little worse, or at least a little more inconvenient, which, in the world of medieval butchers, is really saying something. So just relax, take a slow breath, and let's continue drifting through this oddly fascinating, slightly unpleasant slice of history where survival, necessity, and a whole lot of determination came together in one of the most underappreciated jobs of the medieval world. And as that faint, ever-present smell continues to follow our poor butcher around like a loyal but deeply unfortunate companion, we can gently drift into another layer of his life. Because it turns out the job wasn't just physically exhausting and socially awkward. It was also wrapped in a surprisingly strict system of rules, expectations, and oversight. Because medieval towns loved their regulations, and butchers, being responsible for something as important as food, were watched very closely. Which sounds reassuring at first, until you realize that being watched closely in the medieval sense often meant constant pressure, frequent inspections, and the very real possibility of punishment if you didn't meet the standards, which, again, were not always easy to meet given the tools and conditions of the time. Now, this is where guilds come into the picture, those slightly intimidating, highly organized groups that controlled who could do what in a town, and butchers were no exception. You didn't just wake up one day and decide to start chopping meat. You had to be trained, approved, and accepted into the guild, which meant years of apprenticeship, learning the trade step by step, probably starting with the less glamorous tasks, like cleaning, carrying, and generally being told what to do by someone who had already survived this profession long enough to have opinions about everything, which they were more than happy to share, usually in a tone that suggested you were doing everything slightly wrong. And apprenticeships were not exactly a quick process. They could last for years, during which you were expected to learn not just how to cut meat properly, but also how to handle animals, how to manage customers, how to maintain whatever level of cleanliness was considered acceptable, and most importantly, how to follow the rules. Because the guild had a lot of them. Rules about where you could work, when you could sell meat, how you could price it, and even how fresh it had to be. Which sounds obvious, but remember, this was a time before refrigeration. So freshness was a constant challenge, and if you got it wrong, people noticed. And when people noticed, the guild noticed, and when the guild noticed, things could get uncomfortable. Because here's the thing. Guilds weren't just friendly professional associations. They were powerful organizations with the authority to enforce their standards, and enforcement could include fines, public shaming, or even being banned from practicing your trade, which, if you're a butcher, is kind of a big deal, because that's your entire livelihood. So there was this constant low-level anxiety running in the background of the job. Not only do you have to deal with the daily mess and the physical demands, but you also have to stay on the right side of the guild, which is watching, judging, and occasionally stepping in to remind you who's in charge. And then there were the inspections, which, as you can imagine, were not the highlight of anyone's day. Officials would come by to check the quality of the meat, the cleanliness of the workspace, and whether everything was being done according to the rules. And while this was meant to protect the public, it also meant that the butcher had to maintain a certain standard at all times, which is easier said than done when your entire job involves things that are, by their nature, messy, unpredictable, and prone to going slightly wrong. So there was always this balancing act between doing the work efficiently and keeping everything looking respectable enough to pass inspection, which is kind of like trying to keep your kitchen spotless while cooking a very complicated, very messy meal. Except the stakes are higher, and the consequences are more severe. And let's not forget about the hours, because if you thought the job might at least offer a reasonable schedule, well, that would be nice. But unfortunately not very accurate. Butchers often worked long days, starting early and continuing until everything was done. Because animals don't process themselves, and customers expect to buy meat at certain times. So there was this constant pressure to keep up with demand, which didn't always align neatly with the butcher's personal comfort or energy levels. And since this was before the concept of work-life balance became a thing people talked about, the expectation was simple. You work until the work is finished, and then you do it all again the next day, which, over time, could be quite exhausting, both physically and mentally. And speaking of exhaustion, it's worth mentioning that this was not a job you could do halfway. It required strength, coordination, and attention to detail, because mistakes could be costly, not just in terms of wasted product, but also in terms of reputation. And reputation mattered a lot, because in a close-knit medieval town, word traveled quickly. And if people started to think your meat wasn't up to standard, or worse, that it might make them sick, your business could suffer, and recovering from that kind of damage was not easy. So there was a constant need to perform well, to maintain quality, and to avoid errors, even on days when you were tired, uncomfortable, or just not feeling particularly enthusiastic about the whole process, which, let's be honest, was probably quite often. Now let us gently drift into another aspect of the job that doesn't get talked about as much, but is quietly significant, and that is the emotional side of things, because while it's easy to focus on the physical and practical challenges there, that's also the question of how a person feels about doing this kind of work day after day. And while some butchers likely developed a certain level of detachment, treating it as just another task, others might have found it more difficult, especially at the beginning, because dealing with animals in this way requires a certain mindset, one that balances necessity with emotional distance, and not everyone finds that balance easily. So there may have been moments of discomfort, hesitation, or even guilt, particularly for apprentices who were still getting used to the realities of the trade. And yet, despite all of this, the work continued, because it had to. People needed meat. The town depended on it, and the butcher was part of that system, whether he liked every aspect of it or not. And over time, what once felt strange or unpleasant might have become routine. Just another part of daily life, which is both a testament to human adaptability and a slightly sobering reminder of how people can get used to almost anything if it becomes their normal, even something as challenging as this. And then there's the matter of competition, because of course, the butcher wasn't the only one in town. There were others, all trying to sell their meat, attract customers, and maintain their place within the guild, which added another layer of pressure, because it's not enough to simply do your job. You also have to do it well enough to stand out, or at least not fall behind. And in a market where everyone is offering similar products, small differences in quality, price, or reputation can make a big impact. So there was this ongoing, quiet competition, not necessarily dramatic or aggressive, but always present, influencing decisions and shaping behavior in subtle ways. And as we continue to float through this slow, steady rhythm of medieval life, it becomes clear that being a butcher was about much more than just cutting meat. It was a complex, demanding role that required skill, discipline, resilience, and a willingness to navigate a world that was not always kind or convenient. And while it may not have been glamorous, it was undeniably important, forming a crucial link in the chain that kept the town fed and functioning, even if the people doing the work didn't always receive the appreciation they deserved, which, in its own quiet way, adds a layer of irony to the whole story, because sometimes the most essential jobs are also the least celebrated. And so, as the day slowly comes to an end, and our butcher finally has a moment to pause, perhaps sitting down, tired, but still carrying that familiar scent, we can take a gentle step forward into the next part of this story, where we'll explore even more of the small, often overlooked details that made this life both challenging and strangely fascinating. Because in a world without modern conveniences, every task carried its own set of difficulties, and the butcher, more than most, had to face them head-on day after day, with a kind of quiet persistence that, while not always glamorous, was certainly remarkable in its own understated way. And as the long, exhausting day of our medieval butcher slowly blends into the next, with very little separation beyond a brief stretch of sleep and maybe a moment to question life choices, we can gently drift into one of the more public aspects of the job, because unlike many professions that happened quietly behind closed doors, butchering was often something that unfolded right in the open, or at least in semi-open spaces, which meant that the sight sounds and most importantly the byproducts of the work were not exactly hidden away from the rest of the town, and this created a situation that was, in a word, messy, and in several more words, consistently inconvenient for everyone involved. So picture a narrow medieval street, already struggling with mud, occasional waste, and the general chaos of daily life, and now add a butcher at work, processing animals, rinsing tools, and trying to keep things moving efficiently. And what you end up with is a steady flow of material, let's call it, that doesn't always stay neatly contained, because drainage systems, as we mentioned before, were not exactly advanced, so a lot of what came out of the butchering process ended up going into the street, or into nearby gutters that may or may not have been functioning properly, and this is where things start to get particularly unpleasant, because now it's not just the butcher dealing with the mess, it's everyone in the immediate area. And of course, townspeople had opinions about this, as you might expect, because while they appreciated having access to meat, they were less enthusiastic about stepping around the remnants of its preparation on their way to do literally anything else. So complaints were not uncommon. People grumbled, authorities occasionally stepped in, and there were ongoing efforts to regulate where and how butchering could take place, often requiring it to be done near water sources so that things could be washed away, which sounds like a reasonable solution until you realize that washed away often meant moved slightly further down the street, which didn't exactly solve the problem so much as relocate it. And so the cycle continued, with everyone doing their best to manage a situation that was, at its core, inherently difficult to control. And then there's the water itself, which plays a surprisingly important role in this whole process, because water was essential for cleaning, rinsing, and generally trying to maintain some level of order. But the quality of that water was not always what you would hope for, especially in busy urban areas where the same sources were used for multiple purposes, some of which were not particularly compatible with the idea of cleanliness. So the butcher might be using water that was already less than ideal, which adds another layer of challenge to the task of keeping things sanitary. And again, by medieval standards, this was acceptable, but by modern standards, it's enough to make you quietly grateful for things like indoor plumbing and regulated water systems. And as all of this is happening, the butcher is still expected to produce a product that people are willing to buy and consume, which means maintaining a certain level of quality despite the environmental limitations and the constant presence of factors that are not exactly helpful, like heat, insects, and the general unpredictability of working with raw meat in an open setting. So there's this ongoing effort to manage, adapt, and keep things under control, even when control feels like a slightly optimistic goal. And speaking of heat, let's take a moment to appreciate how much worse everything becomes when the weather is warm. Because without refrigeration, temperature plays a huge role in how quickly meat spoils, and during hotter months, the window of time in which the meat remains fresh is significantly shorter, which means the butcher has to work faster, sell faster, and hope that everything moves quickly enough to avoid waste. Because spoiled meat is not just a loss of income, it's also a potential health risk. And if people start getting sick, the blame often falls on the butcher, whether it's entirely fair or not. So once again, we see that familiar theme of pressure, responsibility, and the constant need to stay just ahead of things that are trying to go wrong. And then there are the animals that didn't quite cooperate, because while it would be nice if every part of the process went smoothly, reality had other plans. Animals could be unpredictable, sometimes difficult to handle, and occasionally outright stubborn, which meant that the butcher had to be prepared for moments of chaos, brief bursts of activity where things didn't go exactly as intended. And while these moments might not have been constant, they were certainly memorable, adding a layer of unpredictability to a job that was already demanding enough without surprises. And through all of this, there's a kind of quiet normalization that happens both for the butcher and for the people around him. Because when something becomes part of daily life, even if it's unpleasant, it gradually starts to feel ordinary. The sights, the smells, the routines. They blend into the background, and what might seem shocking or uncomfortable to an outsider becomes just another part of the day, which is both fascinating and slightly unsettling, because it shows how adaptable people can be, even in conditions that are far from ideal. And yet, despite this normalization, there were still boundaries, still attempts to manage and control the situation, because no matter how used to it people became, there was always an awareness that things could get out of hand, that standards needed to be maintained, and that some level of order was necessary to keep the town functioning. So regulations evolved, practices were adjusted, and the butcher, once again, found himself navigating a complex set of expectations, balancing efficiency with responsibility, and doing his best to keep everything moving in a way that was acceptable to both the guild and the community. And as we slowly continue this gentle drift through the realities of medieval life, it becomes clear that the butcher's world was one of constant negotiation, between necessity and discomfort, between practicality and perception, and between the limits of the time and the expectations of the people. And while it may not have been the most glamorous or pleasant profession, it was undeniably a vital one, rooted in the everyday needs of the community and shaped by the unique challenges of the era. So as the light begins to fade and the activity of the day gradually settles, leaving behind a quieter, though still faintly scented, version of the same streets, we can take a soft step forward into the next part of this story, where we'll explore how this life, with all its difficulties and peculiarities, fit into the broader rhythm of medieval society, and how the people who lived it found ways to carry on, adapt, and in their own way, make the best of a situation that was never particularly easy, but always necessary. And as the quiet of the evening gently settles over those same narrow streets that, just hours ago, were significantly more eventful, our medieval butcher doesn't entirely escape his work. Because unlike some professions where you can clock out and mentally leave everything behind, this was not one of them. The job had a way of lingering, not just in smell, which we've already established was basically permanent, but also in reputation. And in a small medieval town, reputation was everything. It followed you around, shaped how people spoke to you, and quietly determined where you stood in the social order, which for a butcher was complicated, to put it politely. Because on one hand, everyone needed the butcher. He was essential, part of the daily functioning of the town, the person who made sure that meat appeared on tables and in markets, and that alone should have earned him a certain level of respect. But on the other hand, his work was seen as messy, not just physically, but morally and symbolically as well, because dealing with blood and death on a daily basis placed him in a category that many people found slightly uncomfortable, like they appreciated the outcome, but preferred not to think too much about the process or the person behind it, which created this quiet distance, a kind of social buffer where the butcher was included, but never quite embraced in the same way as, say, a baker or a tailor, who smelled significantly better and dealt with less existential material. And then there's religion, which in medieval life was not just a part of society. It was woven into almost everything, including how people viewed different professions. And butchers found themselves in an interesting position here as well, because while providing food was not inherently wrong, the act of killing animals carried certain spiritual and ethical considerations. And depending on the time and place, there were rules about when animals could be slaughtered, how it should be done, and how it aligned with religious practices. So the butcher had to be aware of more than just technique and timing. He also had to navigate a set of expectations that extended into the moral and spiritual realm, which added yet another layer of complexity to a job that was already full of them. For example, there were specific days when meat consumption was restricted, often for religious reasons, which meant that demand would fluctuate, sometimes dramatically, and the butcher had to adjust accordingly, planning around these cycles, making sure not to overproduce when people weren't buying, and then being ready to meet increased demand when restrictions were lifted, which required a level of foresight and flexibility that might not be immediately obvious when you think about the profession, but was very much a part of it, because again, nothing about this job was as simple as it might seem at first glance. And beyond the practical aspects, there was also the matter of perception, because people often associated butchers with certain personality traits, not always flattering ones. Things like being rough, blunt, maybe a little intimidating, which, to be fair, might have been partially accurate given the nature of the work, but also became a kind of stereotype, something that influenced how others interacted with them, sometimes creating a bit of social distance, even in everyday situations, like conversations in the market or interactions at community events, where the butcher might be present, but not necessarily the center of friendly chatter. And yet, despite all of this, butchers were still part of the community. They had families, homes, routines beyond their work, and like everyone else, they participated in the rhythms of medieval life, attending gatherings, observing traditions, and finding moments of normalcy in between the demands of their profession, which adds a human dimension to the story, reminding us that behind the role, behind the smell and the reputation and the regulations, there was a person navigating a life that was shaped by circumstances, but not entirely defined by them. And speaking of family, this is another area where things get interesting, because trades like butchery were often passed down through generations, meaning that if you were born into a butcher's family, there was a good chance you would eventually become one yourself, not necessarily because you had a deep passion for it, but because it was the established path, the skill set available to you, and the most practical option in a world where opportunities were limited. So the life of a butcher wasn't just an individual experience. It was often part of a larger family story, one that continued over time, with each generation learning the trade, adapting to its challenges, and carrying it forward. And this generational aspect also meant that knowledge and techniques were preserved and refined, passed from parent to child, master to apprentice, creating a kind of continuity that helped maintain standards and ensure that the work was done properly, even as conditions changed and new challenges arose, which is in its own quiet way a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the people involved, because despite everything, they found ways to make it work, to sustain their livelihood, and to contribute to the community in a meaningful, if not always glamorous way. And then there's the matter of trust, which, as we've touched on before, was absolutely crucial. Because when people bought meat, they were placing a certain level of trust in the butcher, trusting that the product was fresh, properly handled, and safe to consume. And in a time without modern testing or regulation systems, that trust was built through reputation, consistency, and personal experience, which meant that every interaction, every sale, every piece of meat contributed to an ongoing relationship between the butcher and the community, one that had to be maintained carefully, because once trust was lost, it was very difficult to regain. And so, the butcher had to be mindful not just of the technical aspects of his work, but also of how he was perceived, how he interacted with customers, and how he upheld the standards expected of him, balancing the rough, practical nature of his job with the need to maintain a certain level of professionalism, which, again, is not the easiest thing to do when your daily routine involves everything we've already discussed, but it was part of the role, and one that could not be ignored. And as we continue this slow, steady journey, letting each detail settle into place, it becomes increasingly clear that the life of a medieval butcher was shaped by a complex web of factors, physical, social, economic, and even spiritual, all intertwined in a way that made the job both essential and challenging, familiar yet misunderstood. And while it may not have been the most desirable profession from a modern perspective, it was, for those who lived it, a reality that demanded effort, resilience, and a certain acceptance of things that could not easily be changed. So as the night deepens and the town grows quieter, with only the faint echoes of the day remaining, we can gently move forward once more, continuing to explore this world in all its subtle, often overlooked complexity, where even the most ordinary roles reveal layers of experience that, while not always pleasant, are undeniably part of the rich, and intricate tapestry of history, and where our humble butcher, in all his challenges and contradictions, remains a quietly fascinating figure worth understanding, even if we're quite happy not to trade places with him. And as the night slowly fades into another early morning, with that familiar routine quietly waiting to begin again, we can ease into one of the less talked about, but deeply important parts of a medieval butcher's life, and that is the simple fact that this job was not particularly kind to the human body, which might sound obvious, but when you really sit with it, when you imagine doing this kind of work day after day, year after year, it becomes clear that the physical toll was not just occasional or minor. It was constant, slowly building over time in ways that were difficult to avoid and even harder to treat. Because let's start with the most immediate concern, which is injury, and unfortunately, this was not a rare occurrence. Working with sharp tools, heavy animals, and unpredictable conditions meant that cuts, scrapes, and more serious accidents were always a possibility, and while a small cut might not sound like a big deal, in a medieval setting, even a minor wound could become something much more serious, because infection was a constant threat. And without modern medicine, antibiotics, or even a clear understanding of how infections worked, something as simple as a poorly cleaned cut could turn into a long, painful problem that interfered with your ability to work. And since your ability to work was directly tied to your survival, this created a situation where even small injuries carried a level of risk that we don't often think about today. And then there were the more significant injuries, the kind that came from handling large animals or using heavy tools, because it wasn't just about precision, it was also about force. And when you combine strength with repetition, fatigue, and less than ideal working conditions, the chances of something going wrong increase. So a slip of the hand, a moment of distraction, or an animal moving unexpectedly could lead to injuries that were not only painful, but potentially life-altering, especially in a time when recovery options were limited and rest was not always a practical choice, because taking time off meant losing income, and losing income was not something most people could afford. And beyond injuries, there's the issue of general health, because working in close contact with animals and raw meat exposed butchers to a variety of health risks, some of which were not fully understood at the time. Diseases that could pass from animals to humans, or conditions that developed from constant exposure to certain environments. And while people may not have had the scientific knowledge to explain these risks, they certainly experienced the effects, which might have shown up as recurring illness, unexplained symptoms, or a general sense of not feeling particularly well, which, over time, could become just another part of daily life, something to be managed rather than solved. And let's not forget the strain on the body from the work itself, because this was not a sedentary job. It required standing for long periods, lifting, cutting, carrying, and repeating the same motions over and over again, which can take a toll on muscles and joints, leading to aches, fatigue, and a kind of wear and tear that builds gradually, often without much relief, because again, the expectation was to keep working, to push through discomfort, and to continue doing what needed to be done, even when your body might have preferred a different plan, like rest, or at the very least, a slightly less demanding routine. And then there's the matter of cleanliness, or rather, the challenge of maintaining it, because as we've already explored, the environment in which butchers worked was not exactly ideal from a hygiene perspective. And while efforts were made to clean tools and surfaces, the overall conditions made it difficult to achieve anything close to what we would consider sanitary today, which meant that exposure to bacteria and other unpleasant elements was a regular part of the job. And over time, this could contribute to health issues that were difficult to avoid and even more difficult to treat, creating a situation where the very act of doing your job could slowly impact your well-being in ways that were not always immediately obvious, but certainly significant. And if that wasn't enough, there's also the simple fact that medical care, when it was available, was not always effective. Treatments were often based on limited knowledge, and while some practitioners were skilled and experienced, the overall system lacked the consistency and reliability that we might expect today. So if a butcher did fall ill or suffer an injury, The outcome was uncertain. Recovery might be slow, incomplete, or in some cases, not happen at all, which adds a quiet layer of vulnerability to the profession, a sense that things could go wrong, and when they did, there were no guarantees about what would happen next. And yet, despite all of this, the work continued, because it had to. The demands of daily life didn't pause for injury or illness, and so butchers, like many people of their time, learned to adapt, to work through discomfort, to manage their conditions as best they could, and to carry on, because the alternative was not always an option. And in this way, their experience reflects a broader reality of medieval life, one where resilience was not just admirable, it was necessary, a basic requirement for navigating a world that offered limited support and expected a great deal in return. And there's something quietly sobering about that. The idea that so much of daily life involved managing risk, accepting discomfort, and continuing forward despite challenges that would feel overwhelming by modern standards. And while it's easy to look back and focus on the difficulties, it's also worth acknowledging the strength and determination it took to live this way, to wake up each day and do what needed to be done, even when it wasn't easy, even when it wasn't pleasant, and even when the odds were not entirely in your favor. And as we let that thought settle, gently moving through the slow rhythm of this story, we can begin to see the medieval butcher not just as a figure defined by his work, but as a person navigating a complex and often unforgiving environment, balancing necessity with endurance, and finding ways to keep going in a world that didn't offer many shortcuts or easy solutions, which, in its own quiet way, adds a layer of depth to this already fascinating, if slightly uncomfortable, glimpse into the past. So as the morning light begins to return once again, bringing with it the start of another long day, we can take a soft step forward, continuing our journey through this world of effort, routine, and resilience, where even the most ordinary roles reveal stories of persistence and adaptation, and where our medieval butcher, despite everything, remains a steady, if somewhat weary, presence in the ongoing rhythm of life. And as another day quietly begins, with that same predictable rhythm settling back into place, we can gently drift into a part of the butcher's life that might seem a little less messy at first glance, but is, in its own way, just as stressful. And that is the question of money, because at the end of all the effort, all the cutting, all the standing and enduring and managing, the butcher still had to make a living, and making a living in a medieval town was not always as straightforward as simply, do the job, get paid. There were layers to it, complications, small frustrations that added up over time, and a constant awareness that things could go wrong in ways that were difficult to recover from. Because unlike modern systems where prices can adjust freely, medieval butchers often operated under regulations that controlled how much they could charge for their meat, which meant that even if their costs went up, or their workload increased, they couldn't always pass that on to the customer. And while this was meant to keep things fair for the public, it also created a situation where the butcher had to carefully manage his resources, making sure that every animal, every cut, every sale contributed to a balance that allowed him to stay afloat, which, as you might imagine, was not always easy, especially when unexpected problems appeared, as they so often did. And one of the biggest problems, the kind that quietly loomed over everything, was spoilage. Because without refrigeration, meat had a limited window of freshness, and once that window passed, the product became significantly less desirable, and by less desirable, we mean unsellable, which translated directly into lost income. So there was this constant race against time, a need to process and sell meat quickly enough to avoid waste. And while experienced butchers developed a sense for how to manage this, it was never completely predictable. Factors like weather, demand, and even simple timing could affect how things played out, which meant that some days were better than others, and some days were not particularly profitable at all. And then there's the matter of supply, because the butcher didn't just magically acquire animals whenever he needed them. There were systems, relationships, and sometimes negotiations involved, whether it was dealing with farmers, traders, or other suppliers. And these interactions could be influenced by all sorts of factors, from seasonal changes to local conditions, and even broader economic shifts, so maintaining a steady supply of animals at a reasonable cost required not just skill in butchery, but also a certain level of awareness and adaptability in managing these connections, because if supply became inconsistent, everything else would be affected, and the delicate balance of the business could start to wobble. And let's not forget about taxes and fees, because of course those existed. Medieval authorities were quite aware of the value of trades like butchery, and they made sure to collect their share, whether through direct taxes, market fees, or guild-related costs, which meant that a portion of the butcher's earnings was always spoken for, leaving less margin for error when things didn't go as planned. And since things didn't always go as planned, this added another layer of quiet financial pressure, something that sat in the background of daily life, influencing decisions and shaping the way the butcher approached his work. And speaking of decisions, there were also choices to be made about how to use each animal, because efficiency mattered. Every part that could be sold or used contributed to the overall income, so the butcher had to be careful, making sure that nothing was wasted unnecessarily, finding ways to make use of different cuts, different parts, and even things that might not seem particularly appealing at first, because in a world where resources were limited, making the most of what you had was not just smart, it was essential. And this required a level of knowledge and creativity that went beyond simple cutting. It was about understanding value, demand, and how to align the two in a way that kept the business running. And then there were the customers, because while we've touched on them before, their role in this financial picture is worth exploring a bit more. People had expectations, preferences, and sometimes complaints, and the butcher had to navigate all of that while maintaining his own needs, which could lead to moments of tension, small negotiations over price or quality, and the occasional dissatisfaction that had to be managed carefully. Because again, reputation was everything, and keeping customers reasonably happy was part of the job, even when it wasn't particularly enjoyable, which, let's be honest, was probably not uncommon. And through all of this, there's a kind of constant mental calculation happening, a quiet awareness of numbers, timing, and outcomes, because every decision, from when to process an animal to how to price a cut, had an impact on the final result. And while it might not have been written down in neat ledgers or analyzed in the way we might do today, it was still there. A practical understanding of how to keep things balanced, how to avoid losses, and how to make enough to continue, which, in many ways, is the core of any business, just expressed here in a much more hands-on, immediate way. And yet, despite all the effort, all the planning, and all the experience, there was always a degree of uncertainty, because the medieval world was not particularly stable. Unexpected events could disrupt supply chain demand or create new challenges, and when that happened, the butcher had to adapt, sometimes quickly, sometimes with limited options, because waiting was not always possible, and flexibility was not just an advantage, it was a necessity, a skill that developed over time as part of surviving in a world that didn't always follow predictable patterns. And as we slowly continue to drift through this steady, unhurried exploration, it becomes clear that the financial side of being a medieval butcher was not just about earning money, it was about managing risk, balancing competing demands, and navigating a system that required both practical skill and careful judgment, all while dealing with the physical and social aspects we've already discussed, which, when you put it all together, creates a picture of a profession that was far more complex and demanding than it might initially appear. So as the day moves forward once again, with customers arriving, transactions taking place, and the quiet hum of activity continuing, we can gently take another step along this path, exploring even more of the subtle details that shaped this life. Because in a world where nothing was guaranteed, everything required effort. Even the most routine aspects carried their own challenges, and our medieval butcher, steady and persistent, continued to navigate them one day at a time, with a kind of quiet determination that, while not always visible, was very much present in every part of his work. And as the steady rhythm of work continues, with the familiar cycle of animals, tools, customers, and quiet financial calculations repeating itself day after day, we can gently shift our attention to the people around the butcher, because despite how it might seem, this was rarely a completely solitary job. And in fact, many butchers relied on assistants, apprentices, and sometimes even family members to keep everything running, which on the surface might sound helpful. And it was, but it also came with its own set of challenges, responsibilities, and small, persistent frustrations that added another layer to an already complicated profession. Because let's start with apprentices, those young individuals who, for one reason or another, had found themselves at the beginning of the same path, standing in that same workspace, breathing in that same atmosphere, and slowly learning what it meant to be a butcher. And while this was an opportunity to gain a trade, it was not exactly an easy introduction to working life. Apprentices often began with the least glamorous tasks: cleaning tools, carrying water, managing scraps, and generally doing whatever was needed to support the more experienced workers, which meant long hours, physical effort, and a lot of observation, because learning this trade required watching, listening, and gradually understanding the techniques and rhythms involved. And of course, learning by doing also meant making mistakes, which, in this environment, could be inconvenient at best and problematic at worst, because a poorly handled tool, an incorrect cut, or even a moment of inattention could disrupt the workflow, waste resources, or create extra work for everyone else. So the butcher, now in the role of mentor or supervisor, had to balance patience with efficiency, correcting errors, giving instructions, and maintaining the pace of work, which is not always easy, especially when you're already dealing with everything else the job demands. So there were likely moments of frustration, small exchanges of sharp words, and the occasional sigh that said more than any explanation ever could. And then there were assistants, individuals who were no longer beginners but not quite masters, people who had enough experience to handle tasks independently, but still worked under the direction of the main butcher, and their presence helped distribute the workload, making it possible to handle more animals, serve more customers, and keep things moving more smoothly, at least in theory, because in practice, managing a team, even a small one, comes with its own complexities, coordination, communication, and the need to ensure that everyone is doing their part correctly, which again adds to the mental load of the butcher, who now has to think not just about his own actions, but about the actions of others as well. And let's not forget that these working relationships were often long-term. Apprentices could spend years learning the trade. Assistants might stay for extended periods, and over time, a kind of routine would develop, patterns of behavior, expectations, and unspoken understandings about how things were done, which could make the work more efficient, but also more rigid, because once a system is in place, changing it is not always easy, even if improvements are possible. So the butcher might find himself working within a structure that is familiar and functional, but not necessarily flexible, which is just another small detail in a life already full of them. And then there's the human side of these relationships, because beyond the tasks and responsibilities, there were personalities involved, different temperaments, levels of motivation, and ways of approaching the work. And when you bring people together in a demanding environment, spending long hours in close proximity, things don't always go perfectly. There might be disagreements, misunderstandings, or simply moments where patience runs a little thin. And while these situations were likely resolved in practical ways, they still added to the overall experience, shaping the daily atmosphere of the workplace in subtle but noticeable ways. And for the apprentices, there's also the gradual realization of what this life actually entails, because at the beginning, the idea of learning a trade might seem straightforward, even promising a path towards stability and independence. But as the days turn into weeks, and the weeks into months, the reality becomes clearer. This is not just a skill, it's a lifestyle, one that involves early mornings, long hours, physical strain, and all the other elements we've been gently exploring. And at some point, there's likely a quiet moment of understanding, a kind of internal pause where the apprentice recognizes that this is what the future looks like. And while that realization might not always be dramatic, it's certainly significant. And yet, for many, this path continued, because despite the challenges, it offered something valuable, a defined role, a place within the community, and the ability to earn a living, which, in the context of the medieval world, was no small thing. So even if the work was difficult, even if it wasn't particularly glamorous, it was still a viable option, one that provided a certain level of security and continuity, and for some, that was enough to outweigh the downsides, or at least make them manageable. And for the butcher himself, having a team meant that the burden of the work was shared, but also that the responsibility for the outcome rested on his shoulders, because at the end of the day, the quality of the meat, the efficiency of the process, and the reputation of the business were all connected to his name. So there was a constant need to oversee, to guide, and to ensure that everything was done properly, which required attention, experience, and a steady presence. Qualities that developed over time as part of adapting to the role. And as we continue this slow, steady drift through the layers of this profession, it becomes clear that being a medieval butcher was not just about individual effort. It was about managing a small, interconnected system of people, tasks, and expectations, all working together, sometimes smoothly, sometimes less so, to produce a result that the community depended on. And while it may not have been the most visible or celebrated role, it was certainly one that required a great deal of coordination and persistence. So as the day carries on, with voices rising and falling, tools moving in familiar patterns, and the quiet understanding of shared work settling into place, we can gently move forward once again, exploring even more of the subtle details that shaped this life. Because in a world where every role carried its own set of challenges, the story of the butcher continues to unfold, one small, steady moment at a time, revealing a picture that is both ordinary and unexpectedly complex, much like the world in which it exists. And as the slow rhythm of ordinary days continues, with its predictable cycles and familiar discomforts, we can gently drift into those moments when life in a medieval town became a little less ordinary. Because every so often, there were festivals, religious celebrations, market days, and special occasions where everything became busier, louder, and for our poor butcher, significantly more stressful. Because while most people looked forward to these events as a break from routine, a chance to eat better food and enjoy a bit of excitement, the butcher experienced them in a slightly different way. More like a sudden increase in workload that arrived with very little sympathy for his already demanding schedule. Because when a feast was approaching, demand for meat didn't just increase, it surged, and not in a calm, manageable way, but in that slightly chaotic last-minute way that humans have always been very good at, where everyone suddenly decides they need something at the same time. And the butcher, who was already working at a steady pace, now had to speed things up, process more animals, prepare more cuts, and somehow keep everything organized while the pressure quietly built around him, which is not exactly the relaxing, festive atmosphere that everyone else might have been enjoying. And of course, these weren't small, casual gatherings. Medieval feasts could be quite elaborate, especially among wealthier households, which meant that expectations were higher. People wanted specific cuts, better quality, and sometimes larger quantities, which required careful planning and execution. Because you couldn't simply improvise everything on the spot. There had to be some level of preparation, even if that preparation was happening within the same limited framework we've already explored. So once again, we see the butcher balancing speed with precision, trying to meet increased demand without sacrificing the standards that his reputation depended on. And then there's the timing, which, as always, played a crucial role. Because when demand increases suddenly, the margin for error becomes smaller. There's less room for delays, less tolerance for mistakes, and a greater need to keep everything moving smoothly, which can be difficult in an environment where so many factors are already working against you, like temperature, supply, and the general unpredictability of working with animals. So these busy periods required not just effort, but focus, coordination, and a certain level of endurance that went beyond the already demanding baseline of the job. And let's not forget the added pressure of visibility. because during festivals and market days, more people were around, more eyes were watching, and the butcher's work became more public, which meant that any mistakes, any signs of poor quality, or even just moments of disorganization were more likely to be noticed. And as we've already seen, reputation mattered. So maintaining a good impression during these high-traffic times was important, even if it meant pushing through fatigue or working a little harder to keep everything looking as it should, which, again, was not always easy under the circumstances. And then there's the simple reality of volume, because more demand means more animals, more processing, more everything. And while having assistants and apprentices certainly helped, it didn't eliminate the challenge, it just distributed it. So the entire team found themselves working at a faster pace, coordinating more closely and dealing with the increased intensity of the environment, which, for a short period of time, turned an already busy workplace into something even more active, more crowded, and more demanding, like the difference between a normal day in a kitchen and the rush of a full house, except with significantly fewer modern conveniences. And interestingly, these periods also highlighted the contrast between how the butcher experienced these events and how everyone else did. Because while others were enjoying the results, the meals, the gatherings, the sense of occasion, the butcher was still in the middle of the process, still working, still managing, still dealing with all the elements we've been quietly exploring, which creates this slightly ironic situation where the person most responsible for making the celebration possible is the one who gets to enjoy it the least, or at least not in the same way, which feels like one of those small historical truths that doesn't get a lot of attention, but is quietly present nonetheless. And once the peak of the activity passes, once the orders are filled and the demand begins to settle back down, there's often a kind of aftermath, a period where the butcher can finally slow down, but also has to deal with whatever remains, cleaning up, managing leftovers, and gradually returning to the normal rhythm, which might feel almost calm by comparison, even though that normal is still far from easy. But after a surge of activity, even a demanding routine can seem a little more manageable, which is one of those small shifts in perspective that happens when you move between different levels of intensity. And over time, these cycles of busy and less busy periods became part of the overall pattern of life, something to anticipate, prepare for, and eventually recover from, adding another layer to the already complex experience of being a medieval butcher. Because it wasn't just about handling the day-to-day challenges, it was also about navigating these fluctuations, adapting to changing demands, and maintaining consistency even when conditions shifted, which required not just skill, but a kind of steady resilience that allowed the butcher to keep going, regardless of what the calendar happened to bring. And as we continue to drift through this quiet, unfolding story, it becomes clear that even moments of celebration, which might seem like a welcome break from routine, carried their own set of challenges for those behind the scenes, reminding us once again that every role in this world had its own perspective, its own experience, and its own set of realities that didn't always align with the surface view. And for our butcher, those realities were shaped by work responsibility and a constant effort to meet the needs of others, even when it wasn't particularly convenient. So as the echoes of the festival fade and the town gradually returns to its usual pace, we can gently move forward once more, continuing our slow journey through this world of effort and endurance, where each new detail adds depth to our understanding, and where the life of a medieval butcher, in all its quiet complexity, continues to unfold, one steady moment at a time. And as the pace of life settles back down from the brief chaos of feasts and festivals, returning to that familiar, steady rhythm that is somehow both predictable and exhausting, we can gently move into another part of the butcher's world that quietly hovered in the background at all times. And that is the presence of laws, rules, and the not-so-gentle consequences of breaking them. Because medieval towns, for all their mud and unpredictability, actually cared quite a lot about order, especially when it came to food. And the butcher, being responsible for something as important as meat, found himself under a level of scrutiny that could feel slightly uncomfortable, to put it mildly. Because this wasn't just about doing your job well, It was about doing it correctly, according to a set of rules that were enforced by local authorities, guild officials, and occasionally very observant customers. And these rules covered a wide range of details, from where animals could be slaughtered, to how meat should be displayed, to how long it could be sold before it was considered unfit. And while some of these guidelines were practical, others might have felt a bit rigid, especially when dealing with the unpredictable nature of the work. But rules are rules, and in this case, ignoring them was not a particularly good idea. And the reason it wasn't a good idea is because the consequences could be quite real. Fines were common, sometimes small, sometimes not so small, depending on the severity of the offense. And while losing a bit of money might not sound too dramatic, in a profession where margins were already tight, it could make a noticeable difference, especially if it happened more than once, which created a strong incentive to stay within the lines, even when those lines were not always easy to follow perfectly. And then there was public shaming, which in a medieval context was not just an abstract concept. It was something that could happen quite literally, because if a butcher was caught selling poor quality meat or violating certain standards, he might be punished in a way that involved public exposure, standing in a visible place, being marked in some way, or otherwise made an example of, which, as you can imagine, was not particularly enjoyable, especially in a community where reputation mattered so much. Because once something like that happened, people remembered, and even if you continued working, that memory lingered, shaping how others saw you and interacted with you. And beyond fines and embarrassment, there was also the possibility of more serious consequences, like losing the right to practice the trade, either temporarily or permanently, which, as we've mentioned before, was a very big deal. Because being a butcher wasn't just a job, it was your livelihood, your identity, and often your family's source of income. So the idea of losing that, of being pushed out of the profession entirely, was not something to take lightly. And it added a quiet layer of pressure to everything. A sense that mistakes were not just inconvenient, they could be genuinely life-changing. And of course, not all mistakes were intentional. Sometimes things went wrong despite your best efforts. Meat spoiled faster than expected. A detail was overlooked, or conditions made it difficult to meet every requirement perfectly. And in those moments, the line between an honest error and a punishable offense could feel a little unclear, which is where that subtle, ongoing tension comes in. The need to constantly be aware, to double-check, to stay just on the safe side of the rules, even when the situation wasn't entirely under your control. And this kind of environment naturally influenced how butchers approached their work, encouraging caution, attention to detail, and a certain level of conservatism in decision-making. Because taking risks was not always worth it, especially when the potential downsides were so significant. So over time, practices became standardized, routines were followed carefully, and anything that might be seen as questionable was generally avoided, which helped maintain order, but also limited flexibility, creating a system that was stable, but not always adaptable. And yet, within this system, there was still room for human judgment, for small decisions and adjustments that shape the daily flow of work, because no set of rules can cover every possible situation, especially in a profession as variable as butchery. So the butcher had to rely on experience, intuition, and a practical understanding of what was acceptable, balancing the letter of the law with the realities of the job, which is not always a simple task, but one that became part of the skill set over time. And as we continue this slow, steady exploration, it becomes clear that the life of a medieval butcher was not just shaped by physical and economic challenges, but also by a framework of rules and expectations that required constant attention, creating a kind of mental landscape where awareness and caution were just as important as strength and technique, and where the fear of getting it wrong, even in small ways, quietly influenced the way the work was done. And there's something almost calming in the predictability of it. The idea that despite all the variables, there was still a structure, a set of guidelines that provided some sense of order in an otherwise messy world, even if that order came with its own pressures. Because in a time where so much was uncertain, Having clear rules, even strict ones, might have offered a kind of stability, a framework within which people could operate, knowing what was expected of them and what the consequences might be if they fell short. So as the day continues with the butcher moving carefully through his tasks, aware not just of what he's doing, but how he's doing it, we can gently move forward once more, following the quiet thread of this life as it unfolds, exploring yet another layer of experience in a world where even the simplest roles carried a depth of complexity that is easy to overlook, but quietly fascinating when we take the time to notice it. And as we slowly approach the end of this long, steady journey, drifting through the narrow streets, the early mornings, the long hours, and that ever-present atmosphere that never quite leaves, we can settle into the final quiet layer of a medieval butcher's life, which is something a little less physical and a little more subtle, and that is the gradual acceptance of it all. Because after years of doing this work, of waking up to the same routine, facing the same challenges, and navigating the same expectations, something changes, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. The difficult parts don't disappear, but they become familiar, and familiarity, in a world like this, has a way of softening things just enough to make them manageable. Because at some point, the smell that once felt overwhelming becomes normal, not pleasant, but no longer surprising. Just part of the background, like the sound of tools or the rhythm of footsteps on a well-worn street. And the work itself, which may have once required careful thought and effort, becomes more instinctive. Movements become smoother, decisions quicker, and what once felt complicated begins to settle into a kind of practiced ease, not because it's easy, but because it's known. And there's a quiet comfort in knowing what to expect, even if what you expect isn't particularly enjoyable. And over time, this routine shapes more than just the workday. It shapes the way the butcher sees the world, the way he thinks about effort, responsibility, and even value. Because when your life revolves around something so essential, so grounded in the basic needs of survival, your perspective tends to follow. Things are measured in practical terms: what works, what doesn't, what's needed, and what can be done. And while that might not leave much room for idealism, it creates a kind of clarity, a straightforward way of approaching life that is, in its own way, steady and dependable. And within that steadiness, there are small moments, quiet pauses between tasks, brief conversations with familiar faces, the subtle satisfaction of a job done well, even if no one makes a big deal of it. And these moments, though easy to overlook, add a certain texture to the experience, reminding us that even in a demanding and often uncomfortable role, there are still traces of normal life, small pieces of connection and routine that make the days feel a little less heavy. And of course, there's also the passage of time, because years go by, apprentices become assistants, assistants become masters, and the cycle continues with new faces stepping into the same role, learning the same skills, and gradually coming to the same understanding that this work, for all its challenges, is part of something larger, a system that keeps the community functioning, that provides something people rely on every single day. And while that might not come with recognition or praise, it carries its own quiet significance, a sense that what you're doing, however unpleasant it may sometimes feel, actually matters. And that idea, that quiet sense of purpose, might be one of the things that helps make the whole experience sustainable. Because when the work is hard, when the hours are long, and when the conditions are less than ideal, having a reason to continue, even a simple one, can make a difference. And for the medieval butcher, that reason was woven into the fabric of daily life. People needed food, the town depended on it, and he was part of making that happen, not in a grand or celebrated way, but in a steady, reliable one. And as we gently step back and look at the full picture, from the early mornings and the physical strain to the social challenges, the financial pressures, the rules, the risks, and everything in between, it becomes clear that being a medieval butcher was not an easy path. It was demanding, often uncomfortable, and filled with small, persistent difficulties that required patience, resilience, and a willingness to keep going, even when it wasn't particularly pleasant. And yet, it was also a role that held a certain importance, one that connected directly to the everyday lives of the people around it, shaping the rhythm of the town in quiet but meaningful ways. And maybe that's the most interesting part of all, not the difficulty, which is easy to imagine, but the persistence, the way people adapted, endured, and continued, finding a balance between necessity and reality, and building a life within those boundaries, even when those boundaries were not especially comfortable, which is in its own calm and understated way a reflection of something very human. The ability to take what is given and make something workable out of it, one day at a time. So as the day comes to a close once more, and the soft quiet of the evening settles over the town, with the sounds fading and the pace slowing, we can let this story gently come to rest, leaving behind the image of a life that was far from ideal, but undeniably real, shaped by effort, routine, and a kind of quiet determination that doesn't ask for attention, but deserves a moment of understanding all the same. And with that, you can let your thoughts drift, maybe a little more grateful for modern comforts, maybe just a little more aware of the lives that came before, and slowly, comfortably, allow yourself to rest, as the world of our medieval butcher fades into the background, steady, persistent, and finally, at peace.